All right. Hopefully, everybody enjoyed their lunch and is in settling in here. I think most of the people have come in from outside, but a good number of you sitting here. I think we'll kind of go ahead and kick this one off. So, as you can see, post lunch, did my first wardrobe change. Hopefully, this keeps it a little spicy. And I was gonna do more, but real estate developers, I only have gray suits and blue shirts, so I took off the tie. So we're about to have Matt come up here and do our keynote address, and someone who's done a lot of work with the ULI Housing Action Committee is Greg Warren, and he's going to introduce Mac. Greg has led DHIC, a Raleigh-based nonprofit affordable housing group, for the past 32 years. Under his leadership, DHIC is the Triangle's leading owner of affordable rental housing, with over 2,200 apartments in its portfolio and another 850 homes, rental homes that will be delivered over the next 2 years. Greg is a graduate of, again, UNC's Department of City and Regional Planning, so I guess that's why we get along so well. So, and he's walking in right now. Well, perfect timing. So please welcome Greg Warren.
Great. Well, thank you. First of all, I just wanted to thank TJ and Andy and John for really being the leaders for this whole convening. It's great to see ULI really focused on the issue, whether or not we call it affordable housing or attainable housing or workforce housing. It's certainly an issue that all of us in the region are concerned about. So my role here is to introduce to you Dr. George Mac McCarthy, who is president and CEO of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The Lincoln Institute seeks to improve quality of life through the effective use, taxation, and stewardship of land. A private nonprofit operating foundation whose origins date to 1946. The Lincoln Institute researches and recommends creative approaches to land as a solution to economic, social, and environmental challenges. Before joining the Lincoln Institute, Mac directed Metropolitan Opportunity at the Ford Foundation, which sought to provide disadvantaged people with better access to good jobs and other opportunities for advancement by supporting regional planning and coordinated transportation and housing development to alleviate poverty and reduce its concentration in metropolitan areas of the U.S., developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Mac is no stranger to the Triangle area. He spent a number of years in the area in the 1980s and the 1990s when he received an MA in economics at Duke and a PhD in economics from the University of North Carolina. So he's kind of gone both ways. He later worked for UNC's Center on Urban Regional Studies, which many of you know is an offshoot of the great Department of City and Regional Planning at Chapel Hill. Immediately following Mac's presentation, Tom Murphy will join Mac for a fireside chat. Mac, welcome back to the Triangle.
Well, thanks, and it's good to be back to the Triangle. I don't get here as often as I should, and if you're wondering, I'm definitely a Tar Heels fan, so sorry that I have the roots at Duke, but no. So, like many of you, I try to get a lot of my wisdom from country and Western songs. And one of the lyrics that I always turn to for real perspective is, I think it was Tom T. Hall, a song he said, I wish I didn't know now what I didn't know then. And I like to reflect on that a lot because very often in this world when we're talking about housing challenges and community development challenges, the growth of cities and stuff, we're very good at like projecting off into the future and asking ourselves, what are we going to do to deal with the trends that we see coming? And which is what we did all morning here. But I like to think about a different exercise, which is to say, what if we look back 20 years and ask ourselves, what should we have done differently then that would have put us in a different place now? Because if we continue to have that conversation between the past and the future, we'll actually learn as opposed to just react, right? And part of looking at trends is only reactive, and part of looking backwards is sometimes learning. And so, the slide here is actually the original platting for the city of Raleigh from 1792. That's what Raleigh was, that was the design for, I guess, what the planning department at the city of Raleigh in 1792 was doing at the time. Interestingly enough, in 1792, we're also building the nation's capital, and we were doing one of the first land value capture exercises in the history of the world, where they actually organized the 27 landowners who owned the land around Georgetown and New Carrollton, Maryland, and they got them to pool the land and lay out Washington, D.C., and they received back from that exercise less than half of the land they contributed, with the promise that the land would be much more valuable. Because at the time, in 1792, nobody wanted to lend to the United States, but lots of people wanted to invest. And so they knew if they created a new city, and they were able to then take some of the new land that they created in the city and sell it to people who wanted to buy that land, they could use the proceeds to actually invest in the streets and the infrastructure that was going to make that city work. And the people who contributed their land, even though they got less than half of their land back, became fabulously wealthy because the value of land in that city went up more than 20 times. So they put in whatever 20 acres, they get back 9, but 9 times 20 is bigger than 20, right? So anyway, it's interesting. The United States has a long history of finding ways of leveraging land for public purpose, and that's one of the things that I'll try to talk about today. But let me just kind of discipline myself by at least trying to maintain an agenda and tell you what I'm going to talk about. So this is all about affordable housing, but I want to think a little bit about affordable housing, like where it comes from and where it goes, right? Because sometimes we kind of forget that there's some evanescence to public housing. It's not a permanent thing. And one of the questions is, why isn't affordable housing permanent? And then if we want to make affordable housing a more permanent part of our landscape, what do we need to think about protecting and preserving that affordable housing? And part of that is understanding that affordable housing, by its very definition, is housing for people who can't afford what the market offers. And there's a lot of reasons they can't afford what the market offers, but part of that reason is because they don't get paid enough. This isn't people who are just on the dole. These are people who are typically working and they just can't afford to find housing. And then I'll give you a few thoughts about the Triangle region. So these are my 4 key messages in case you want to know what you're going to take out of the room if I'm successful. One is that these affordable housing shortages are really stubborn, and they really require creative, coordinated, and committed responses. And one of our speakers from the Triangle J said it. Sometimes you have to get out of your comfort zone to think about the real remedies if you really want to do what you want to do. And part of that is summoning the political will to do the right thing, if we think there's a public good to actually providing shelter to our people. The other thing is you can't build your way out of an affordable housing crisis. It's just really not possible. We just don't build enough housing to do it. But you won't get out of an affordable housing crisis without doing some building. And think about it this way. In the U.S., if we have 20 million families that are not just cost burdened in their housing, but they're severely cost burdened, paying more than 50% of their pre-tax income for housing. In a given year in the United States, a good year, we might build a couple million units of new housing. So how long does it take us to build new housing at a couple million units a year to satisfy the needs of 20 million families that are severely cash burdened? Well, let's say we use inclusionary to do it, and we do inclusionary at 20% of the units we build are inclusionary, so that tells us we're going to build 400,000 units. Well, how many years does it take to build 400,000 units at a time to fill a gap of 20 million units? Well, it takes, 50 years? Do we have 50 years to deal with that? I don't know. I think we don't, and so we can't just rely on production, right? The other thing is, of course, subsidy is absolutely necessary to provide affordable housing for many households. And the real challenge is, number one, how to make the subsidy smart, meaning that once we subsidize a unit, the subsidy stays with the unit. And the other question is, where are we going to get it? And maybe I'll be helpful with a few ideas on that. And then, of course, the bottom line is it's really, really more important to protect our existing affordable housing stock and preserving that affordable housing stock than is to run around trying to build new stuff, because it gets more and more expensive to build new stuff every year. So where does affordable housing come from? Well, on the production side, it's mostly through subsidized production through things like the low-income housing tax credit. The low-income housing tax credit might build a couple 100,000 units a year. And the ironic thing about it, and this is one of those things that just troubles the hell out of me because I think the low-income housing tax credit is actually a very dumb program. It's more expensive per square foot to build a low-income housing tax credit unit than it is to build a market rate unit. And it's not just a little bit more. In a lot of markets, we're talking about 40% gap on the per square foot cost of the livable space in a low-income housing tax credit unit because, as I call it, the low-income housing tax credit is more a full employment for lawyers program than it is a housing program. The soft costs that are associated with low-income housing tax credits and a lot of affordable housing that have capital stacks that are mind-numbing. For anybody that does development in the private market rate development, the exercise is so much simpler than it is to build affordable housing. So of course it's going to be unlikely that we're going to build enough affordable housing because it's just, we make it so damn hard, right? And then on the other side, inclusionary, when we ask market rate builders to just set aside some units for affordable housing, the problem is that no matter what you try to wrangle out of a market rate development to get inclusionary units, you're just not going to get that many. Some of the places that are really aggressive, like say San Francisco, think they can get 30% of new production as inclusionary. Well, then you're going to have a very large kind of profit gap that you're going to be able to draw from to put 30% of your units at below market rates because the numbers are just damn hard to work out. We work with a group called the Grounded Solutions Network. We actually reverse engineered the pro forma for a building to figure out, if you put in all the different variables that dictate what it costs to build, and then you tweak the different policy variables to see how many inclusionary units you could get if you give a density bonus, if you reduce the parking requirements, if you find other ways to, you give away the land, right? You can find out how many units you can get by just running through this exercise with this pro forma. It's called the affordability calculator. And it's a useful tool because one of the problems that I've run into with a lot of my friends who are affordable housing advocates is that they're often guilty of magical thinking where they think that you can get a lot more affordable housing from existing resources than you can actually get. And so one of the things that I've been advocating for around the country is making the entire development process a little bit more transparent and accountable by just letting people see the numbers and understand what's going on. And then making people defend the choices that you make in there, whether it's the hurdle rate for a developer, whether it's the soft cost for the lawyers, whether it's the land cost for the landowner, and letting people understand these are the actual facts. It's just the facts. And then what do we do with that fact? Well, either find subsidy to fill a gap or we just go without housing for a lot of our population. And then the biggest magical thinking I can think of is this idea that filtering actually creates affordable housing because it's largely a myth. There's almost no evidence in the housing stock in the United States that filtering actually creates affordable housing. What filtering creates is substandard housing, and by the time housing that went into the market at market rate ends up filtering down to become affordable, it's also uninhabitable in most cases. So this idea that, and we talked about it today, I mean, some of these garden-style apartments that were built in the 1970s, let's say, they might still be habitable, but I guarantee you they're not economical. And they're not what you would build today to build for affordable housing or for market rate housing. They might be affordable right now, but I guarantee you they're all going to be more and more expensive to maintain over time because they're that old. And you know what the maintenance curve looks like. It just gets more and more expensive the older a building gets. So anyway, so in terms of just low-hanging fruit, how do we meet kind of the unmet need right now that's in the market in almost every city in the United States, and particularly in this region, although this region is not actually in that bad a shape when you've been to as many places as I've been. And of course, the lowest hanging fruit are accessory dwelling units. And I know that you're doing some of that in the Triangle. I guess not in Raleigh, but you're doing it in Durham, right? And one of the good things about ADUs is that ADUs are a way to actually kind of preserve the character of a neighborhood while adding density, because the neighborhood doesn't really change. You're adding a little density by putting a smaller unit on an existing lot, right? And you're maybe making that affordable. But as it turns out, these ADUs, there's a little cottage industry growing up on the West Coast where people are finding ways to put ADUs onto properties quickly and at relatively low cost, maybe $30,000 for an ADU. Some of them get a little bit crazy, fancy, but whatever they are, they're certainly a way to add additional density without adding any, whatever you want to call, raising NIMBY problems in most cases, right? And so right now, I think that the room for addressing, the easy spot for addressing affordable housing shortages is right there with ADUs. And it also answers one of the questions that is always most vexing for people in places where house prices are appreciating quickly, which is, where are my kids going to live if they want to live in the community that they grew up? All right, so where does affordable housing go after it's created? Well, as it turns out, affordable housing evaporates. It's just one of those things because it's a volatile substance, right? So 60% of low-cost units that existed in 1985 were lost by 2013. And this is from the Joint Center and the Hudson Institute. 27% were just demolished and replaced with something else. 18% were converted, meaning to market rates, and then or upgraded to higher rents, another 12%. So 60% just disappear in a matter of 28 years. And then we're looking at 2.5 million units that were priced below $800 a month in real terms were lost between 1990 and 2016, another 26 years, just to show you that they go away fast. And we're looking at the loss of another at least 500,000 low-income housing tax credit units, which will expire out of their affordability periods by 2030. And 250,000 low-income housing tax credit units is probably the full amount that you'll build in about 2 or 3 years. So you build 2 or 3 years production, they just evaporate in the next 12 years. And those are deeply subsidized units. And when we lose them, and if we even try to preserve them, it becomes costly because one of the things that I would say that, what I wish I didn't know now that I didn't know then is that we're just really crappy managers of property in this country. We treat it as disposable way too often. And if you really want to know the story about public housing in the United States, why that was such a tragedy is because we forgot to capitalize it to actually maintain it over time. It wasn't that we concentrated poverty, it's that we let the buildings fall apart, and then the more functional people had to leave. And so then what we ended up with is the only people who stayed in that public housing in Pruitt-Igoe or other places were people who got an advantage to staying in a place because being there gave them some other advantage, like in a building that's 40 stories high with no elevator, being able to occupy the top floors that do the drug trade becomes a lot easier, right? But it's really us, and it's our inability to understand the economics of housing and housing management that says, all right, why is it that in 1987 when we built the low-income housing tax credit that we thought that that it was going to be okay to re-syndicate in 15 years? Why would we need to re-syndicate a building 15 years later? Because we didn't maintain it. All right, and so then, of course, the other big problem is, and this is the big problem that's never going to be addressed, is that the housing market is not a single market. The housing market is actually 2 markets, and we've known that forever, but we've never really kind of understood what the implications are, right? And unfortunately, I'm an economist, so I know that a single price cannot clear 2 markets that are adhering to different sets of fundamentals. And what are the 2 markets? One's the market for shelter, and the other is the market for investment. And over the last 50 years, we've opened up our housing market in the United States to global investment in unprecedented ways. And the flow of capital into our housing markets has become so unprecedented and so destabilizing that we still don't even understand what the implications are of that. But they do understand the implications in other places. And so if you start looking around, so Vancouver, Canada, has started tracking this a few years ago, and they realized that hundreds of millions of dollars was coming in from China alone into their market. And not for shelter, for speculation. People wanted to just ride the wave up because house price appreciation was going on. They go, well, let's invest there. And you know who's guilty of this? All of us. Any of you who has an IRA, any of you who has any kind of managed assets for your retirement probably has it in a diversified account that includes real estate. And all the trends we looked at this morning about where people need to invest, right? Where are the hot markets? Where are prices appreciating? What is that doing? It's attracting global capital and bidding up house prices and bidding it away from people who need shelter. And we tolerate that because we say, well, housing as an investment good and housing as shelter is fine. But really, is it? And then, so we have to ask ourselves that question, especially given that in 2018, San Jose and Raleigh were the two hottest markets, according to Zillow. And if you think it's going to get bad, it'll get worse if capital continues to flow into this market and just bids up housing prices. And what happens when capital comes in and bids up housing prices? It distorts production, because production will gravitate towards that part of the market where the money is and where the returns are. And if you want evidence that we're building in the wrong part of the market, look at the vacancy rates in the high ends of the markets. In New York City, the vacancy rate's over 10% in the highest end of the market, because people own those places, they just don't live in them. You go to Miami, and you'll see the vacancy rate with all those different condos in Miami. You walk down Brickell Ave at night, and you'll see some of those buildings will have 10% of the units lit, because there's nobody else there, because it's all speculation. And just to give you a sense of what's going on, in the top 100 cities in the world, right, where 10% of the world's population lives, and it produces 30% of the world's GDP, it also produces 76% of property investment. And where does it go? Everywhere. And this is just a list of the top cities by the dollar amount of investment, and you see New York and London. Now, the triangle isn't on here because it's not listed as a single city. But I bet you if you recalibrated this on a per capita basis to see how much foreign investment is coming in, the triangle would probably hit this list of the top 50, right? And so, people start telling the stories, they start looking at it, and they start wondering what they're going to do about it. And in 2014 in Manhattan, they realized that 54% of the sales of units that sold for over $5 million were owned by shell companies. Who are the shell companies working for? I don't know, Russian oligarchs? People that are, getting wealth in nefarious ways. Or maybe, maybe we don't care, except it may be in New York they need somebody to build something more than $5 million, penthouses, right? So then the question is, how do we kind of protect our housing stock from the ravages of global capital? I mean, we don't want to make our markets uninvestable. But at the same time, I think as a public choice, we might want to say, as a policy, we want to be able to provide shelter to our people, right? And so part of that is direct action. And one of the things they're doing in Canada now is actually putting a surcharge on the foreign purchase of housing. They've added a 15% surcharge in Toronto and Vancouver. As you'll see in a minute, it might be actually making a difference. Although, I swear to God, if I were in Vancouver or Toronto, if I was a Chinese family wanting to invest in Vancouver and Toronto, I would just enlist a Canadian citizen to be my agent. And it looks like there's some evidence that that's already going on as well. Indirectly, the other way to do it is actually create permanently affordable housing. And permanently affordable housing can be created in a number of ways. One, of course, is shared equity with community land trusts. We heard a little bit about that. Community land trusts are becoming much more popular around the world. We hosted a group from England who was trying to figure out what they're going to do with their affordable housing crisis in London. And we brought them around the U.S. and we showed them different places that had been able to address it in different ways. And we brought them to Burlington, Vermont, which has probably the most effective community land trust in the country, where they, as a regional community land trust, I think they now manage about 6% of the local housing stock. They immediately in London said, yep, this is what we're going to do. And they brought the people from Burlington to London to start creating a citywide land trust in London. And then the New York City did the same thing. And so they understand that, and the idea, of course, in a land trust, you separate the land from the improvements. You only transact on the improvements, so the land isn't there. And one thing that we know, and I think maybe a lot of you know, is that the appreciation of property is almost always in the land. It's not in the buildings, because the buildings depreciate, but the land goes up in value. But then there's, when you do any kind of subsidized or inclusionary housing, there's no reason why you can't protect it permanently with like a deed restriction. I don't know, they had some other kind of term for it here today, but just saying that you are going to limit the future sales price, or you're going to limit access to that property to specific types of future owners or renters. and just means testing, or by making sure that whoever owns and sells it is somebody of like means as you transact. But then there's also permanently affordable subsidized rental, and the biggest permanently affordable subsidized rental stock we have in the U.S. is public housing. There's about 1.6 million units, but they're dwindling away. And with Hope 6, we were replacing on average about 1 unit for every 3 we destroyed when we started to do kind of mixed income redevelopment. RAD, I don't know, is going to do a lot better than that in terms of replacement of the affordable units. But so maybe we're going to end up losing another 500,000 public housing units through the redevelopment of those sites. But then low-income housing tax credits. Why do we say 15 years? Why do we say 30 years now in North Carolina in terms of the term of their affordability? We did a study with Jeff Lubell at APT, and we were asked by the Bipartisan Policy Commission, what would it cost to underwrite a rental property, a low-income housing tax credit or other kind of rental property, to be permanently affordable? What's the difference between how we underwrite it today and how we would underwrite it? And the difference was about $3,000 per unit up front. And all it was the capitalization of a reserve to be able to do the maintenance to maintain the properties long term. So for $3,000 a unit, so instead of resyndicating after 15 or 30 years, or maybe not even being able to resyndicate because you don't have the credits left, right? You actually put the credits in once, and you have an affordable housing stock that actually can be managed long term and maintained as affordable. So I told you that Toronto and Vancouver had imposed these surcharges on foreign buyers. As it turns out, over the last 3 months, the transactions that have been going on in Vancouver have fallen dramatically, and they're wondering if their housing bubble is finally starting to burst. And what's interesting is that when they did a survey of citizens in Vancouver, including homeowners, they all wanted it to burst. They said, no, house prices are just way too crazy here. We want them to fall. That sounds kind of odd, right? But maybe it's because they're Canadian. I don't know. In any case, it's kind of interesting. So the direct charges on foreign purchase to permanently affordable housing, the one country, and I talked about this last night, that was able to really find a way to protect its housing stock from global capital markets was Singapore. And in Singapore, they basically turned their entire country into a community land trust. And right now, the country, starting in 1969, where they set the price of land in 1969, every transaction, the country gets the right of first refusal at that price, right? The country owns 90% of the land, and then they partnered with private developers to develop all the properties that they wanted them to develop with very specific guidelines about unit size, unit mix, and the idea that they would mix incomes within every development to be able, but you wouldn't be able to tell who owned what unit in the development. And then they made their retirement money, their pension funds, liquid so people could actually buy the units. So now Singapore has almost 90% home ownership rate. They have not had a single tick up in terms of their affordability index. This has been tracked by UBS for the last 30 years, right? They've said there's been no movement in their cost burdens for housing in Singapore in 30 years in real terms. And what they did at the same time was they eradicated 250,000 units of housing that were in slums. They replaced them with other housing. So, Singapore can do that. They're kind of an authoritarian state. They decided what the price of land was going to be. They told the developers what to build. But in the end, what they end up with is, answering that question that they wanted to answer themselves is there a public policy reason that they want to actually provide shelter for their people? And they said yes, and that's what we're going to do. 10 or 20% of the housing stock, somewhere between 10 and 20%, is still available for global markets, and it's phenomenally expensive. Some of the most expensive property in the world, as expensive as Hong Kong, right? But of course, what I said is we need subsidy, and then the real question is, where do we find the kinds of subsidy we're going to need to provide affordable housing? And so at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, we say we want to find the answers in land, and we go back to our roots and we say, what is the origin of the value of land in the first place? Where does the value of land come from? And one of the things that we've concluded, and this comes from the early work of a guy named Henry George, is that very often the value of land has nothing to do with the actions of the landowner. But the value of land has something to do with public actions, whether it be public investment in improvements like infrastructure, or public rules that allow the land to be developed in different ways. And so we've helped to think through a whole set of tools you can use to actually extract land value as a way to produce public good. And so, one of the myths about land that I think is kind of funny, especially urban land, is that one of the reasons that land prices get so high is because land is in fixed supply. You don't make any new land. But that's actually not true, because we make new land all the time in cities when we increase density by saying we can build additional floor area ratios above a fixed amount of land. And if you go from 1 floor area ratio to 5 floor area ratios, you've just multiplied your land by 5 times. You've just made 4 times more additional land available for development. But the question is, who owns those air rights? Who owns the developable property that you just created by fiat, by passing a rule? And in most cases, and in the United States, we would say, well, the landowner owns it because we have this kind of crazy idea about what property rights are. But as it turns out, in the rest of the world, they don't think that at all. In fact, they think that anything that the public does that actually increases the value of land, some portion of that should be gotten back by the public. If the public invests in infrastructure and your land values go up, the public should get at least the amount of the investment of infrastructure, if not some of the actual increasing value of land. And so we call these, land value recovery, land value capture tools. And this is just like a list of like 5 that are widely in use around the world. And some of them are actually in use in the United States. But I want to talk about one in particular because it's something that, although it would be a stretch, it's something that we should think about doing in the United States because, in fact, we already do it in lots of places. And that's a sale of building rights to finance redevelopment. And in Sao Paulo, Brazil, they've been able to raise about $4 billion in revenue over about 12 years by auctioning off building rights in different parts of the city that the developers then pay for in order to do new development. And as it turns out, I did a back-of-the-envelope calculation for North Carolina, which is short about 192,000 units of housing. And if I use the metric that somehow, I don't know what the metric was they used in Chapel Hill when they passed that $10 million bond, they're going to be able to preserve 300 houses and build 400 new affordable units over the next 10 years. If I use that metric, I calculate that it's going to take about $4 billion to subsidize the 192,000 units of unmet affordable housing in North Carolina. So all we need to do is find a way to sell building rights, and we'll be able to get that $4 billion if we learn from the Brazilians, right? But anyway, there's others. In Seoul, they did self-financed land readjustments, and they built 500,000 units of housing in Seoul, Korea, mostly through the redevelopment of land along their river, their waterfront. And in Indonesia, they use land readjustment. I can tell you what that is at another time. I don't want to go that far into it. But let's talk about Sao Paulo for a minute. So one of the questions they had in Sao Paulo was, if you own land, what is your as-of right for building? What can you actually build in terms of, let's call it a floor area ratio? What should you be allowed to build? And of course, landowners would all tell you that they should build. We can build whatever the hell you want because you own the land up as high as you want to go, as long as the city will let you go. But a bunch of lawyers that we got together sat in a town outside of Sao Paulo, and they said, "So let's think about this. Is it a right that you have to build, or is it something that you have to actually request permission to do? Because if you have to request permission to do it, then it's not a right." And so anybody that builds in any city in the world has to actually ask permission from the city to build. You have to get a building permit. More often than not, they have to get a building permit, and they're also limited to how far they could build by whatever the zoning is, or the master plan. And so they said, well, what if the city just decided that they could just define what as-of-right development rights the landowner has, and then anybody who wants to build up to whatever the master plan allows, they'd have to buy it. And so that's what they did. They set a basic FAR. They said, if you own land in Sao Paulo, you have the right to build up to 1 FAR. And if you want to build between whatever one FAR is and the maximum FAR allowed in the master plan, you're going to buy it. And you buy it in an auction where they auction certificates that are sold on their stock market. In tradable certificates in 10 square meter increments, they sell these things on an auction market. And the developers bid for these things. And so when they passed this law, one of the things that just stunned me was, I said, man, the developers must have been pissed. And they said, oh no, the developers are actually supported it. I said, well, that's odd. Why would the developers support the idea that they had to actually buy the right to build, over one FAR? And they said because most of the developers in Sao Paulo don't own the land. They're trying to acquire the land. They're trying to buy the rights to develop the land. And they knew that if the landowner knew that they could build to 5 FARs, they're going to have to pay for the ability to build to 5 FARs. But if the landowner could only sell them the right to build to 1 FAR and they had to buy the rest of it, at least the money they spent to buy the rest of it, they knew was going to be invested by the city in infrastructure. So they're going to get something for it. And it wasn't just going to go into the pockets of the landowners. So the developers sat in the sidelines and they said, fine. And so as it turns out, this Fund Urb, where they sold off this stuff, created, I'll just jump ahead. Oh, I forgot, I'm sorry, I let that slide up. It created about $4 billion worth of revenue that the city was able to use. And so I'll just give you an example. So this is a place called Agua Espriada, and right there, that bridge was built using some of the money that was created by the sale of these development rights. And right next to that bridge to the right, you see this thing called the Jardim Edith slum. And that's there's all these slums that circle the cities in Brazil. In Sao Paulo, about 20% of the population lives in slums. So with the money that they got from the sale of the development rights, they redeveloped that slum, and this is that slum in the process of being redeveloped. But they also had enough additional money to build a metro line. And so this is the view of the metro line as seen from the 15th floor of the redevelopment of the slum. And they did it with the money that they were able to generate from the sale of development rights in the rest of the region, which became one of the financial districts of Sao Paulo. And if you think that doesn't happen, it happens in the US. So on Park Avenue in Manhattan, Chase Manhattan on 270 Park decided they wanted to add 20 stories or 18 stories to their building. But they didn't have the development rights because they'd already built to the full FAR of the site. But the city let them trade development rights with others who had unused development rights above their buildings to buy the development rights, to transfer them, so the others would say, I've never used my development right, and you can have it to use yours. And one of the sales was to the church that was across the street, and the church wasn't going to build up to whatever the 5 FARs. They were just going to build what they had. They were an old church, right? And in the process, the Chase had to put into the Public Improvement Fund to process that transfer of development rights, $20 million, that was then used to make other improvements in the city. But other ways, in impact fees, I know developers aren't very fond of impact fees, but just in case you want to find a way to pay for infrastructure, in San Francisco, they've been collecting about $120 million a year of impact fees from development. But in Chicago, they've adopted the Sao Paulo plan where they said, what we're going to do? We're going to put a little ring around the inner loop of Chicago, and anybody that wants a density bonus in Chicago inside the ring is going to have to pay the city for the additional density, and then we're going to invest it in the low-income communities outside of the ring. And so they've created what they call the Neighborhood Opportunity Fund, this landmark fund, and they're now investing millions of dollars in the needy areas outside of the loop with money that they're getting from the new development inside the loop, which is the hot development area. In any case, the point is that you can, by mobilizing new value out of land, the land value that's created from public action or by public investment, you can actually create the subsidy you might need to shelter your population. But in order to do it, you have to really think through what it is you're trying to do. You're trying to provide shelter for your people. And the way you provide shelter for your people is to make sure that the unearned gains of landowners don't go in the pockets of landowners, but they come back to the people who created that value, and in most cases, that's the public sector. And like I said, in most cases, unless developers are huge landowners, they see that there's really that there's a win-win proposition for them, because they're going to pay for the development rights one way or the other, but they're really going to pay the landowner or they're going to pay the city. They're not going to end up with it themselves. So anyway, it's just food for thought, and there's a lot more. And in fact, I have a short publication I'll leave on the table if anybody wants to learn some more about it, that we just put out a little fact sheet about land value capture. All right, but anyway, so I told you I was going to tell you about the what could be done in the triangle. Well, of course, I'll give you like 7 recommendations or 8 recommendations. One is, of course, just get aggressive on doing ADUs. It's easy to do. There's lots of people who can, start this market up. There's lots of people who could use the additional revenue. A lot of cash-burdened households, particularly landowners, could become less cash-burdened if they can put an accessory dwelling unit on their site and rent it to a low-income person, right? The other thing is, of course, to coordinate transit and affordable housing development. I know there's an effort to do that along the Orange Line between Chapel Hill and Durham, but really, the idea of integrating transit and affordable housing has been the formula for success in some of the most successful cities in the United States, whether it's Salt Lake City or whether it's Minneapolis, St. Paul, or Denver, or even Fort Worth and Dallas. I think that there is a reason to think about adopting mandatory inclusionary zoning if you can. I think it requires some kind of legislative action, because I think there's some legislative rule that prevents you from doing it. But I would advise against some blunt instrument like saying like a 20% mandatory inclusionary rule. And I would find a way to adopt a tool like the affordability calculator to say, what is a reasonable expectation we can get out of an individual deal? And then, I think really one should think about growing your subsidy with charges for development rights, and especially when you're doing rezoning. Find a way to fight this external speculation, because you think it's a good thing, and the cities very often think it's a good thing because it bids up their tax base. But in the end, it doesn't really help anyone if people are just occupying your space and not even using it. They're just speculating and trying to, take money away. And then I would say you find a way to protect a growing share of your housing stock as permanently affordable through community land trusts or deed restrictions. And once you put subsidy into a unit, keep it in the unit. Don't let it go escape. This is one that's being talked about in San Francisco and California, and it's being used in Massachusetts, preemptive zoning, where you don't allow local governments to have the last word on zoning. But if you decide that all local governments have to share in their affordable housing burden, that you allow the state to come in and force people to accept some affordable housing in their jurisdiction. They do this in Massachusetts. They have a thing called Proposition 40B, where if a jurisdiction doesn't have a minimum of 10% of their units affordable, and a developer proposes to develop affordable housing there, the state can come in and preempt the local zoning and permit that development. And then, establish urban growth boundaries. That sounds funny because you think that's what will make housing less affordable, but as it turns out, it only does if you don't do a good job of monitoring land and rental markets to decide when to actually expand, but you expand in a planned way, not in an unplanned way. And you don't just expand infrastructure service in crazy ways like they did in Michigan, in Detroit, which eventually made that place bankrupt. All right, well, I've thrown a lot at you. I'll just kind of give you a couple of closing thoughts. There really isn't a simple answer to how you confront affordable housing problems, but if you get to some kind of clear analysis and you actually start to do that kind of conversation between what should I have done 20 years ago and what do I need to do in the next 20 years, I think you'll end up with getting to some better conclusions than just trying to respond to and react to trends. And you really got to build a public commitment, and you got to find the leadership to actually deal with the problem, to create the subsidy, to actually challenge the NIMBYs and others who don't want density, right? Because in the end, density is what you're going to end up having to do in this area. And this area is flat. I mean, there's just not that much density in the entire triangle. You need to have the adequate resources. You got to implement the right plans, and you got to look ahead. Because if you don't start now to deal with affordable housing problems, they only get worse. And this is what we encountered in California, where 15 years ago, I was in San Francisco, and they were kind of whining because it was taking $160,000 of subsidy per unit to produce affordable housing. But now it takes almost $500,000 a unit to produce affordable housing there. And so they're still whining, but they're no further along than they were, 15 years ago. All right, well, thank you, and I urge you to take a look at our website at the Lincoln Institute. We have lots of resources. We're always happy to share them. They're all free. And I will, like I said, I'll leave a policy brief about this land value capture instruments on the table if anybody's interested. So thanks so much.
Have a seat.
Okay.
We have a few minutes. Something we've not talked about today, Mac, and I thought maybe we ought to bring it up, is the idea of opportunity zones. It's a new federal program, I think led by your U.S. Senator, or South Carolina's Tim Scott. Is he yours or South Carolina? And he introduced it. It's been approved. It was in the tax bill that passed, and it provides opportunity to invest capital gains liabilities into areas, and the question is whether that will have any impact whatsoever in the question of affordable housing or not.
Yeah.
Because it's a new revenue stream.
It's a new revenue stream, and I guess it depends on how. Is this on? Or the lights on? I guess it depends on how the money's used. It's I haven't really been able to fully wrap my head around it because the capital gains can be earned anywhere. And then they're supposedly going to be brought to the opportunity zones that are underinvested.
Right.
And I guess it's just another way, like CRA and others, that we try to bring capital to capital-starved areas, right? But one of the things we've seen recently is that capital-starved areas turn around really, really rapidly when you start bringing capital in.
It become unaffordable.
And then they become unaffordable. And if you look at Brooklyn,
Right.
Brooklyn has become
Right.
the craziest place
Right.
in the U.S.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, for me, the jury's out. I'm just not sure. And I really want to wait and see who it is that tries to make use of those things, because I have a feeling that there's going to be people in capital markets that are going to be able to game that in some way.
I'm watching it happen already.
Oh,
but
okay.
I think that, so if any of you are, if you're not aware of opportunity zones, it's something you want to learn about because it has the potential to bring significant new capital into areas designated by the city and the state. We don't have a lot of time. Let me just get, part of, I think the challenge of the triangle is that there are multiple municipalities that are all doing relatively well. And the question of how do you get the region, I don't know if you've dealt with this anywhere. I mean, because you could have Raleigh say, we're going to do all these really good things to create affordable housing, and Durham says, we're not doing anything, right?
Right.
And so now you set up a competition within and so you have probably, maybe as many as 10 or 12 pretty clear markets around here. How do you overcome that? Have you seen that happen anywhere else?
Yeah. So the best example I can think of is Denver, right? And in Denver, when John Hickenlooper, who was the mayor of Denver at the time, he organized what he called the Mayor's Caucus, and he invited all the mayors from the entire region to come together and to work together to think about how they could turn Denver into what they wanted to call a world-class city. And one of the first things they did was they signed this non-proliferation agreement, which said they wouldn't steal businesses from each other, right? And what they realized is that, because that's a zero-sum game, one jurisdiction steals a business, he jumps the border, you give some kind of tax incentive for them to do it. The other district loses the tax base, and you've given away your tax base, and the real winner is the company that's going to play you off against each other, right? But then they said, what we really need to do is understand what it will take to make Denver a world-class city, and they decided it was going to be a major investment in public transportation. And in order to get that done, they had to do it regionally. They couldn't do it one jurisdiction at a time or one county at a time. And so they decided what they were going to do is, as a group, they were going to go to the voters and ask the voters to tax themselves to the tune of $6 billion to invest in a light rail system that would serve the entire region. It was going to take 20 years to build. And in Colorado, they have a taxpayer bill of rights, so every new tax has to be voted by referendum on the vote, and 2 out of 3 people voted to support that tax. They added a 1 cent surcharge to their sales tax, and they just started going. And after that, they created this civic coalition that said, not only are we going to do this investment in our transit system, but we're going to make sure that it actually finds a way to serve the entire population. And so they started to integrate housing development with transit development. They formed this thing called Mile High Connects, which is all the philanthropies, the universities, the healthcare organizations came in to say, how are we going to make this place successful, equitable, and a world-class city all at the same time? And they went back to the voters and they asked the voters to actually add yet another surcharge to the sales tax to invest in art. And they invested in public art and arts institutions and artists to kind of beautify their area. And if you go to Denver, all over Denver, you run into this art in public places. And it's just a place that it just kind of enriches the quality of life there. And Denver's been on a trajectory that you wouldn't believe in the last 20 years.
And to add to that, there's 78 transit stops now along this 620-mile system that's built out. And probably on half of them, there is major development happening. And a lot of it has included affordable housing. So you have the transit driving significant development, as we talked about later. Let's open up quickly. We have a couple minutes to questions. Anybody have any particular questions for Mac? We have about five.
I actually have a question here in the back, one of the mic holders.
I can't see it all, but go ahead.
On the ADU front, you said that was the lowest hanging fruit. That's a great opportunity for us. I don't know the ins and outs of it, but it is legal in Durham. And from the statistics I've seen, and maybe someone in the room can correct me, I think we've seen 10 to 12, no more than 15 per year on average being built. So that's more than you see in Raleigh, where it's not legal at all, but it's also, I'm guessing, not a number that's going to
It's not going to move the needle right away, is it?
Right.
No.
So are we, I won't say is Durham, are we doing something wrong here? Are there cities that are doing this better and seeing the numbers that are needed with an ADU policy? Is there something we can change, or?
Well, so I would say that if you think that ADUs are a good policy for addressing affordable housing challenges, you find a way to incentivize it. And the easiest way to incentivize ADUs is to make capital available for people who want to make the investment but don't have the available capital. And maybe they can't, because it's become a lot harder to do things like get second mortgages on your existing house or whatever. And so if you can find a way to make it easier with low-cost capital for people to do it, you expedite the permitting process, you do everything it is to kind of remove the barriers, then that market starts to generate itself, and pretty soon you have a market that starts to work without any kind of incentive. But very often what you need to do to get a market kind of chugging along is to provide the right kinds of incentives, and capital is really one of the first things.
Mac, other questions? Yes.
Hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I'm a county commissioner in Durham County, and curious, we're looking at using our land where we were going to build parking decks alone to wrap those decks with housing, including affordable housing. Can you speak to the use of surplus property, public, institutional, religious institutions, enlisting the broader community to look at ways to help with affordable housing?
Sure, I can give you two ways to think about it. So one of the things that we've been doing is we've been developing what we call these scenario planning tools that allow for public participation in planning and to help to visualize what is going to be done as a way to engage the local community in both the decision making and the understanding of what's going on, but to enlist their support. But then on the other side, I was just in the Middle East and in Israel, where they have a huge affordable housing problem. And what they do is, because a lot of the land is owned by the state, what they've decided to do is, whenever they make land available for development, they do a reverse auction. And what they do is they tell developers to come to them with their best ideas about what they would do on that site. And then they offer to the developer that gives them the best ideas, that brings the most affordable units, whatever the best design, the green space, the other things they want, onto that site. Then they convey the development rights in that way, right?
And so, and very often it doesn't involve any exchange of money. What it involves is exchange of the things that you want that are public goods that are going to come out of that development. And so I think it's a really good process to use as a way to find the right developer and the right ideas and to figure out what's feasible on the site, right? And rather than you try to figure it out and then try to find the developer to do it, you get the developers to come to you with their best ideas.
One other question?
She wanted
go
to
ahead,
follow up with.
Are you suggesting then that for our parcels where we want to do a parking deck, we put it out to the development community to come back and say how they would mesh affordable housing instead of prescribing it?
Exactly, and they come back to you. So it's like a reverse auction. You go, we were going to make this site available to develop. We need whatever. We need 80 parking spots. I don't know what you need, but, and we want to see how well we could develop the site. You tell us, and then the thing is, if the city's in the game, they can also make the permitting a lot easier. Right, especially if they've also got the neighborhood and others kind of on board for whatever they're going to be doing. Right. So it's a process that leads to probably better outcomes in the long run than just going and whatever deciding what's going to be developed and try to find someone to do it.
One last question. Mac, what I got from you is that it's fundamentally all about leadership.
It is, yeah.
And that the cities have lots of tools, both financial and non-financial tools, available if you start putting those tools together into a vision about and a commitment to affordable housing. You can create a big dent in the market, and that takes a huge amount of leadership, which I have not seen exist in any city in America.
No,
For affordable housing.
not for affordable housing, and that's because affordable housing has gotten such a stigma attached to it.
Right.
But in California, when they passed that SB 375, which said they were going to reduce carbon emissions to 1990 levels by whatever, and when they did it, they didn't realize that they weren't going to be able to do it by just increasing the fuel efficiency of their fleet and getting industrial emissions reduced. And they said, uh-oh, we're going to have to do something different. And they realized they're going to have to figure out a way that they're going to redesign their cities to reduce the amount of vehicle miles traveled by cars, right? And they created the California Air Resources Board to review the plans and all that. But so we started to participate with a group in the Bay Area that wanted to build out. They're building out BART, and they wanted to find a way to attach affordable housing to BART, because BART's original plan when they were going to build out BART was they were going to build new BART stations and put a parking garage next to it. And they said, well, why don't you put housing there? And of course, so they went to this wealthy suburb, it's kind of more upper middle class suburb just south of Oakland called San Leandro. And they went to San Leandro and they said, instead of building a parking deck here at your spot, we'd like to build 3,000 units of multifamily housing. And of course, they went to the city council and it got voted down unanimously. But then they started this charm offensive in which they started to actually work with the city council. They started bringing them around, showing them what actually newly constructed affordable housing in the Bay Area looked like. They showed them how they could kind of mix the commercial development, affordable housing development, how they could even give them places where their kids could afford to live because they couldn't afford to buy any place in San Leandro. And in about a 3-year period, they flipped the city council to approving that development. And now, instead of just building a big parking garage, they're actually going to build 3,000 units of housing at this site. And part of it is just being able to get people kind of comfortable with the idea that what they're doing is not necessarily going to negatively impact their quality of life in a place like that.
And I really think it is really, we're talking about local leadership. I think historically the federal government has been the leader.
Oh, they're MIA.
And we're all believing they're gone
Yeah.
now. And
Yeah,
the
they're
state
done.
governments largely have abandoned
Yeah.
this conversation. So if you're going to solve this problem, you're the solution. Good luck. Thank you. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks.
Yeah, they're out to lunch. And even under Obama's administration, there wasn't that big of a...
While they're closing down, thank you
burning up,
again
putting out
to
fires
Mac
and
and to Tom. And we're going to take another 10-minute break and then come on back for the next panel. So thank you very much.